Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another episode of Talk Architecture. And we have a series of podcasts right before the start of the new year in 2024. So we get on right away to the first episode. Yes, the first episode that ever was in Talk Architecture podcast, which was on the design curriculum and the design process. The diagram there in the thumbnail will explain to you again something familiar if you're familiar to Talk Architecture podcast. We're going back to that first episode, and that was in April 2020. Now it's December 2023. So what have I got for you? What I have for you is some sort of understanding of what has happened, what has transpired, and it's kind of like the first episode was kind of dry, straightforward. I created a diagram based on my experience doing design thesis for 8+ years, and then I put it down paper, and it was during the online training or during the time when we had the pandemic or not being able to do face-to-face interaction, but social distancing. So that was the time when I did that diagram, and that was the outcome of it. And I explained about it and how the disadvantage we have when we have social distancing when we conduct studio. So obviously, we've learned a lot from that. I could add further points about that, but let us go back now to the topic at hand, which is methodology or design methodology and the design curriculum. Looking at that diagram on the design thesis, sort of linear, and you can use it as a loop, going back to different phases when you start with identifying the topic at the beginning and coming out with a scheme. So in general, that's what we do when we set out to do a very independent final year project, something that is almost always the same way of approach in terms of thinking that student of architecture at some point, especially in the master's course, the part 2 course, they would have to actually do more work in actually laying down the foundation of that particular project. So some call it the design thesis of the final year. And in this case, I would argue that if you really want to do a topic, you start a couple of years before, in which you deep dive into the subject and the topic and all the readings around that. If it's housing, if it's transportation hub, if it's market, farmers market, or whatever that is necessary for you to read around it, and if it's in a rural area or in the middle of the city, and the sort of cultural background to it as well. So we just accept that most of the students of architecture will be focusing on the site that is where they are studying or where the university is, because the frequency of going to the site will be important. Then there's also the more theoretical of topics where they go and visit something far from where they are staying. Maybe they visit Italy when they're staying in the UK, and then they visit a certain area, and they would also try to understand about that place that they visited. There's a different way and approach to looking at the contextual or the cultural aspect of the design thesis, depending on the tutor, depending on the studio master, how the design methodology is going to be. Is it much more hypothetical or much more grounded or site-specific? As we know it in qualitative research, we have different research approaches, some of which are case studies and some of which are action research and grounded theory and so on, a lot borrowed from social science. Architecture has evolved, and a lot of which we look at architecture now is some sort of disparity between architecture production and architecture theory. And we learn it in different subjects. So it's more of a production drawing thing and more of a slice of investigation or a special study that one could conduct before one graduate. So what is the best approach? It depends on the school and it depends on the tutor at hand. So we've seen projects in the Architectural Association School of Architecture where the final year project was even a computer simulation or other sort of very highly hypothetical way of approach that is the favorite or is the investigation by the tutor, and diverse approaches was sort of celebrated in some schools of architecture. And as long as the students of architecture can have an inquiring mind and certain observation skills, and depending on whether the school wants theoretical knowledge or high regard to the mastering of concepts and the mastering of theories rather than the production of drawings, is depending on the school, obviously. So we have known of this, and almost always in Malaysian schools of architecture, you don't go for that more theoretical leanings. You go for a more practical, much more a thesis that is brought down to earth, so to speak. Less theory. Theory is important somewhat, and theory can even be just defining the problem statement very well, or the design problem. So we accommodate ourselves to the situation at hand, where as an academic, if it is necessary to do that way, we'll do that way. But we could be bent or more leaning towards theoretical subjects, or more on the students understanding beyond the problem statement, which is just purely more on research dissertation problem statement. Is beyond that if you want to regard architecture as straddling between arts and humanities. If you regard back to where architecture comes from, and then there would be a difference between architecture, design, and social science objectives. So looking at this in this way, what do the academic do? Of course, there are examples in the School of Architecture that, you follow this example and you get the students to produce this report at this time. And in this report, you have the site analysis, you have the client's brief, obviously, and then you have the research or the case studies, and then you have the site analysis must be comprehensive enough, and then you come up with a brief of accommodation. But some schools of architecture, they say, no way, that is like a vocational training that is more akin towards engineering or even social science. It's not really the traditional architecture school way of doing a design thesis. I mean, and architects are different in which the architect need to actually understand a lot of things before you can ever call yourself an architect, So, yeah, but then the other party would argue again, no way. Architect need to actually be grounded or be practical and ready to be in practice, ready to be employed. And the expectations of the industry is that the architectural graduate would have enough skills to be able to tackle a project immediately. So what do I do when we think about all this? What did I do as a studio master or someone who took care of design thesis? It was something that I kept on thinking, but because I was from a vocational training background in University Technology Malaysia way back then, when, whenever in the 80s, and I was so used to that approach. So that's the approach that I went along with, and I could channel or design the program according to that approach. It is my go-to approach because I learned architecture from a very young age in that way. I was exposed to more of a theoretical leanings when I was in Leicester Polytechnic with Theo Matoff as the department head, and he was bent on more of proportion systems, or in terms of theory, those of the Palladian proportions, and architecture was more of the subject of dissecting and analysis of forms and space. So I was exposed to that, but it is more than that. What I was approaching from a vocational standpoint, and what I was exposed when I went to Leicester Polytechnic, in terms of how do I want to compete with the other students, I needed to learn that method because I was losing out on the grades by just thinking of the vocational training that I had. So I had to actually understand what is going on there, to able to compete, because I needed to get the good grades to go to a better school, obviously. So I learned that, and I came out with something quite technical, but yet able to show that it has a sense of architecture, proportion, and system in it, in terms of theory, looking into the thinking behind, Richard Meyer's art museum in Frankfurt. I mean, that sort of thinking on the contextual, cues, and using that proportion system with my elevation. So I understood that. I eventually understood that that's the play, that's the game that I needed to do. As a student of architecture, we're constantly trying to understand what is it required from the studio tutors. What did they actually want? What did they actually think a project is supposed to be? So we didn't really care about their approach or anything. We want to know how it is that at the end of the day, what should we be doing that could get us an A. We didn't really think about what the tutors are thinking. We want to know what the tutors want, the expectations, so to speak. So that's what we do when we are in architecture design studio and architecture practice at the end of it. So with the design methodologies, this is what I discovered, and I have not had the opportunity to actually explore other theories. Teaching architectural theory, I had to read on about all the sort of approaches that other people have, but myself, I haven't been able to employ any of these philosophies or design methodologies myself, but I perhaps I had make it much better in terms of my interactions with the students and trying to get them to understand about architecture. Yeah, this is what I think I did. With the help of partners such as Kevin Matlow and the others, Anthony and Lim, Tek Bing, and a number of people that I meet along the way, Lisa Fu, and others who were the tutors on their own right, having their way of approaching them, and whoever had a sense of guidance that I could learn from, I did learn from. But to be honest, I did not want the same thing that I had faced or I had undergone when I was back then in the 1980s in the vocational training approach. I did not want to do that again. I learned enough theory that students of architecture can command the keywords, can actually understand, comprehend the debate or the discussion at hand. So that was very interesting when different critiques come in and gave the sensibilities or the input into the crit to make students of architecture think. But they were not the ones who are guiding them right until the end. So it's up to the studio masters to actually do that. We use those crits or the quotes and references that these visiting critiques come up with to help the students see some sort of reference point to moving ahead or moving forward their design. If it doesn't help them, then we would tell, well, we have our own opinion that we don't think that this crit or the quotes that was given, or advice for that matter, was helpful because the student seems blur or didn't understand. But there are students who would take the challenge, and some were really influenced by some of the critiques, challenges. And we want to give a sense of balance the whole matter to the student, because we wanted them to gain confidence. We want them to actually do something that they think is worthwhile, even if it led them to a wild goose chase sort of scenario for a couple of weeks, but they get quite frustrated really if that happens to them. So the design methodologies from different schools of architecture allowed by the head of department flourishing in that school of architecture do underline a statement that this is the philosophy of the school, and sometimes some validation of the school's curriculum is in question because they disagree with that school's way of approaching the subject matter or approaching the studio curriculum. So, some of it become very, very, shall we say, strict or regulated in a way that no way are we going to allow students who graduate from that school be validated by our board of architects from our country, for example, because it is not according to what we believe the design methodology should be. So when we talk about design methodology, as academics, like I said, again, we suit ourselves to the situation at hand. There is our belief that students need to actually understand more on theory, but we can't have it in a way that is how they would do it in certain countries or in certain schools of architecture that is not validated by our country's board of architects. So what we did was we tried to inject more theory into the program in a different way. So that's why this curriculum that I mentioned, the first episode on the design process and the studio curriculum episode, it's like that. That's the way that it was required for us to come up with a curriculum for 36 weeks, which comprised of 7 to 8 weeks in the beginning, the special semester, and 14 weeks thereafter respectively for the first and the second semester. So we look at how the expectations of the school at the end of the day with what the student needs to produce, and that is relating to the expectations of a comprehensive design project plus complexities of a certain nature, and enough drawings to show that students really worked on it for a long time over and over again. And that was the expectation of the school, really. So if you were to look at that curriculum and design process that I mentioned the first episode, looking back at it, yeah, all these 3 years, we're finally coming into almost 4 years, actually, when we go to next April. But almost 4 years of thinking about what had happened and where are we going with this. Decidedly, the Board of Architects of a country would put down their foot on what is to be expected of architecture graduates in the country. But there could be loopholes, or there could be gaps in actually skillfully having students who are much more skillful and actually coming out from schools of architecture as such. We're not talking about what after they have worked for a year or two. We're talking about fresh graduates coming out school of architecture who could tackle the architectural practice head on. It takes a while. There's no way is it that you could actually just jump right in unless the school of architecture in the final year train the students to be so. And therein lies the conundrum of schools of architecture, whether some people believe that and they think that students of architecture, fresh graduates, should be able to tackle certain projects when they come out of the school immediately. So what does that mean? It is always of a debate or where people say, no, school of architecture, you can do anything. And then you come out, that's different, that's practice, and you deal with it. That's why they have all sorts of design methodologies out there. But is it for some countries when they want the students, fresh graduates, to be almost prepared to be practicing architects who could deal with just about as what one expected without much training in architecture practice? Is that fair? You would like to ask this question about what is the role of schools of architecture in anywhere, what is the role of school of architecture in terms of giving the student the sense of freedom to explore as much as they want a particular subject. So is that true that some schools you end up with students of architecture or graduates who are not ready to be going into the architecture industry as what you expected, or they are more bent on academia or more bent on other design subjects, be it fashion design or product design or anything else? Is it really of a concern that students of architecture at the Part 2 level do not become an architect eventually? Well, we can't really pinpoint it like generalizing it. We can't really generalize the whole thing because there are different human beings with different backgrounds and aspirations. They could have done a lot of reading in architecture school and then they want to be a writer, and that's fine. So the traditional way of approaching the curriculum as reflected with the traditional sort of architect role model or model, it's not that clear, really. Do architecture students end up being illustrators? I'm talking about Part 2 graduates. Do they end up being more of an illustrator, more of going into a BIM manager, or more of coming up with models, 3D models? And is that what we want? So there's always, I can't really pinpoint this debate in a way that from what point of view, POV, point of view of whom is this being asked, or this being subjected to, or being asked, is what references do we want to have? So that's the situation of architecture graduates and architects as a whole. That's the question that we're asking. And quickly, the graduates, if you come from a certain school, you have to acclimatize yourself quickly to get into the mainstream of architectural practice development. And hence, some people don't see themselves in the long run staying in architecture company, but going to a developer's company, for example, and then just think about getting a better pay, which is up to them, really. That's the way. I'm not criticizing if that is your main agenda. So, in a way, can we say that the architecture profession has allowed a lot of things and yet nothing to happen? I mean, a lot of things can be interpreted, and the individual comes out of School of Architecture, make their own way, make their own start, make their own entry level aspiration to get into the industry, make their own way of finding how they can be feel as part of the community and do it in a way that they are happy and peaceful about it. Make it peace. Make a peaceful conclusion to why they are in architecture. So, of course, the cleverest way is, okay, you train your students of architecture this way, and then you get into the industry this way, and there'll be a clean sort of transition between the School of Architecture and the industry, whereby the industry is expecting to look at these qualities in students of architecture. So that is what people think mostly what should have been done or should be doing. Is it? So, yeah, there's still a lot of questions since that first episode when I pushed out a diagram, when I started talking about the linear progression with loops going back to rectify and have more of that phase being done so that you can move on to the next phase sort of scenario in design process and curriculum. We go through the rites of passage, and that's the rites of passage of architecture design, especially for the final year, where you gotta have some learning, you gotta have some methodology that you can adopt from your lecturer who has created that methodology. You can adopt that methodology into your own approach into architecture. That is the bottom line. It is valid, whatever approach that your lecturer has done, because you have accepted it and you realize that it is a good approach. And then you will also use that design approach when you get out from the School of Architecture after you graduate. And this is the thing. Individuals have to not sit on the fence and be what? You want the vocational training? I am the vocational training lecturer. Follow me. Yes, students will follow that approach, design methodology, graduate, and then make their way through the practice. And then there's also the architecture graduate who had been taught a different type of design methodology, which is totally to do with theory and theoretical thinking and hypothesis, and don't even care about the site context, but very knowledgeable in certain area. I'm going to be graduated and I will use this approach when I am in practice. What is practice anyway? Then there's a whole other debate on what is practice. What is architectural practice? And I'm just humbled by it all, really, because I can only explain as much as I could from my standpoint, my own experience. And I hope that you guys could benefit from this chatter, this episode on looking back at the first episode and how we're going to think about this design curriculum and the design process in the final year of the Masters of Architecture course, or whatever you call it in your country. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.